There are moments in life that divide everything into two parts: the life you thought you were living and the life that was actually happening around you. For 18 years, Darius Coleman believed he was one of the lucky ones. He had a wife he trusted with his life, a son he loved more than anything, and a family that seemed to stand together through every celebration, every setback, and every milestone. He worked long hours, missed birthdays with friends, turned down vacations, and carried the weight of providing because he believed every sacrifice was for the people who loved him most. Then one ordinary afternoon, a conversation inside a hospital changed everything he thought he knew. In less than 5 minutes, the foundation of his marriage, his fatherhood, and his identity began to collapse. The most painful part wasn't discovering the truth. It was realizing that the truth had never been hidden from everyone else. His wife knew. Her parents knew. Her sister knew. A man he had called his closest friend knew. Even people in the neighborhood had whispered about it for years. The only person left in complete darkness was the man who had dedicated his entire adult life to protecting the family everyone else knew was built on a devastating secret. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. At first, each memory seemed meaningless on its own. Together, they formed a picture that would eventually reveal one of the most heartbreaking betrayals imaginable. For the next several days,
I'm afraid the tests show
Darius
the
tried to
condition has
convince himself
progressed.
that he was overthinking everything. He told himself
We
there
need
had
to
to be
discuss the
another
next steps
explanation for the
immediately.
doctor's concern. Hospitals made mistakes. Medical records got mixed up. Test results were sometimes wrong. He had heard stories about that before, and he desperately wanted this to be one of those stories. But every time he looked across the dinner table at 18-year-old Malik Coleman, he found himself noticing details he had ignored for years. It wasn't that Malik looked unfamiliar. It was that he suddenly looked familiar in a different way. The shape of his eyes, the way he smiled, even the way he tilted his head while listening reminded Darius of someone he had known for most of his adult life. The realization hit him so quickly that he almost dropped the glass of water he was holding. He immediately pushed the thought away, ashamed that he could even allow himself to think something so painful. Malik was the little boy he had carried on his shoulders through neighborhood parades, the teenager he had taught to drive, the young man whose every achievement filled him with pride. Nothing could erase those memories. Yet the questions refused to leave his mind, growing louder each time he tried to silence them. Angela seemed different too, though Darius couldn't say exactly why. She had always been attentive, asking about his day before he even took off his work boots, reminding him to slow down and enjoy dinner instead of rushing back to paperwork. Now she seemed distracted. Sometimes he caught her staring into space before forcing a smile the moment she realized he was looking at her. Other times she would pick up her phone, read a message, and quietly leave the room. Under ordinary circumstances, Darius never would have questioned it. Trust had never been an issue between them. 18 years of marriage had taught him that love required faith, and he had given Angela that faith without hesitation. But once doubt finds its way into someone's heart, even the smallest moments begin to carry a different weight. Darius hated the person he was becoming, but he couldn't stop searching for answers. As the week continued, old memories returned one after another with surprising clarity. He remembered a family barbecue nearly 15 years earlier when Angela's older sister had laughed and said, "Malik must have gotten all his looks from somebody else's side of the family." Everyone around the picnic table had laughed, but the laughter ended almost as quickly as it began. Angela's mother had changed the subject so abruptly that Darius barely noticed it at the time. Looking back now, the silence that followed seemed far louder than the joke itself. The more he reflected, the more uneasy he became. Every birthday party, every graduation, every holiday gathering replayed in his mind with painful detail. Faces he once associated with joy now seemed guarded. Smiles looked forced. Conversations appeared carefully measured. He began asking himself whether the people closest to him had ever truly celebrated with him, or whether they had simply spent 18 years protecting a secret they believed should never come to light. That question hurt far more than the doctor's words ever could. If one person lies to you, the damage is personal. But when an entire circle of family and friends quietly agrees to keep the same secret, the betrayal reaches far beyond a marriage. It changes the way you remember your entire life. Late one evening, after Angela had gone to bed, Darius walked into the garage and opened an old storage cabinet filled with family photo albums. For hours he turned page after page without speaking a single word. There was Malik's first birthday covered in blue frosting. His first day of kindergarten wearing a backpack nearly as big as he was. Family vacations to Florida, fishing trips along the Gulf Coast, school awards, basketball tournaments, and high school homecoming photographs. Every picture represented a memory Darius treasured. Yet for the first time, he found himself looking beyond the smiles and searching the faces in the background. He wondered if any of them had looked at him that day while silently carrying the truth. By the time the sun began to rise, Darius realized he hadn't slept at all. He closed the final photo album, leaned back in his chair, and quietly admitted something he had been trying to avoid ever since leaving the hospital. If he wanted answers, he could no longer depend on hope alone. He would have to uncover the truth for himself, no matter where it led or how much it might cost. The following morning, Darius left for work earlier than usual, but instead of driving straight to the construction site, he pulled into a quiet parking lot overlooking a small lake just outside the city. It was a place he often visited whenever life became overwhelming. Usually, the calm water helped him think clearly. That morning, nothing felt peaceful. His mind kept returning to the same question over and over again. Why would a doctor sound so certain if there wasn't a serious reason for concern? He replayed every word from the hospital in his head until he could almost hear the conversation as if it were happening again. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that waiting for someone else to explain things would only make the uncertainty worse. If there was an answer, he had to find it himself. By the time he arrived at work, he barely noticed the noise of heavy equipment or the conversations around him. His crew had never seen him so distracted. One of the foremen even asked if everything was all right at home. Darius forced a smile, gave the same answer most people give when they're carrying something too heavy to explain, and quietly said everything was fine. It was a lie that became harder to tell with every passing hour. That evening, Darius stopped by his mother's house after work. She had always been the one person who could read him without him saying a word. As soon as she opened the front door, she looked into his eyes and knew something was weighing on him. They sat together in the kitchen, coffee growing cold between them as ordinary conversation slowly faded into silence. Finally, she asked whether he and Angela were having problems. Darius hesitated before admitting that something had happened at the hospital that didn't make sense. He intentionally left out the details because he wasn't ready to speak the words aloud. Instead, he asked a question that seemed harmless on the surface. Have you ever thought Malik looked different from the rest of our family? His mother paused much longer than he expected. It wasn't her answer that unsettled him. It was the hesitation before she answered. She eventually smiled gently and reminded him that children often inherit features from distant relatives. Her explanation sounded reasonable, yet something about her expression stayed with him long after he left. For the first time in his life, Darius wondered whether even the people who loved him most were choosing their words carefully. Over the next few days, his attention shifted toward memories he had ignored for years. He remembered that Angela had always insisted on handling certain paperwork herself, especially anything involving medical records or school forms. At the time, he appreciated how organized she was. Now those moments carried a different meaning. He also remembered that whenever conversations turned to family medical history, Angela would quickly answer before anyone else had the chance. Darius had trusted her completely, so he never questioned it. Trust has a way of making ordinary behavior seem perfectly normal until one unexpected moment causes every memory to be examined from a different angle. By Friday afternoon, he reached a decision he never imagined he would have to make. Without telling Angela, he contacted a private laboratory and arranged for a legally recognized DNA test. His hands trembled as he completed the paperwork. Every signature felt like an admission that the life he believed in might already be slipping away. As he sealed the final document inside the envelope, he whispered a quiet prayer that he had never prayed before. He wasn't asking for the truth. He was asking for the strength to survive whatever the truth turned out to be. Walking back to his truck, he realized that once the results arrived, there would be no returning to the man he had been only a week earlier. Whether the test confirmed his worst fears or proved them completely wrong, his life had already changed. The waiting had begun, and with each passing day, the silence inside his own home felt heavier than anything he had ever carried. The days that followed felt longer than any Darius could remember. Every morning began with the same routine, yet nothing felt familiar anymore. He still kissed Angela goodbye before leaving for work. He still reminded Malik to drive safely when heading out with friends. He still answered phone calls from clients, signed invoices, and supervised construction projects across the city. To everyone else, he looked exactly the same. Inside, however, every hour was consumed by a single question whose answer was already beginning to frighten him more than the question itself. He found himself studying the people he loved without meaning to. He watched Angela laugh during dinner, wondering whether guilt had become so natural that it no longer showed on her face. He watched Malik talk excitedly about college applications and imagined the little boy who used to climb onto his shoulders after every Little League game. Those memories were real. The laughter was real. The love was real. Yet Darius couldn't escape the feeling that the foundation beneath those memories had been quietly shifting for years while he stood there believing everything around him was solid. One afternoon, while sorting through paperwork in his office, Darius came across an old photograph tucked inside a file folder. It had been taken nearly 20 years earlier at a neighborhood 4th of July cookout. Dozens of friends filled the picture, smiling beneath strings of red, white, and blue decorations. His eyes stopped on one face almost immediately. Standing only a few feet away from Angela was Andre Brooks, a longtime family friend who had been part of nearly every major event in their lives. Andre had attended their wedding, celebrated Malik's birthdays, and spent countless weekends grilling in the backyard while the children played together. Darius couldn't explain why the photograph unsettled him. There was nothing inappropriate about the way anyone was standing. Nothing obvious suggested betrayal. Still, he couldn't ignore the strange feeling that surfaced the longer he looked at it. He remembered how often Andre had stopped by the house during the early years of his marriage, especially when Darius was working overtime to build his business. At the time, he appreciated having someone he trusted looking out for his family. Now he found himself asking whether trust had made him blind to things everyone else had already noticed. That evening, Darius received a phone call informing him that the laboratory had completed the analysis and that the official report would be available the following morning. The representative spoke calmly, explaining the collection process and confirming his identity, but Darius barely heard the words. As soon as the call ended, he sat alone inside his truck for nearly an hour without starting the engine. For 18 years, certainty had guided every decision he made. He knew who he was. He knew who his family was. He knew what tomorrow would look like. By the time he finally drove home, certainty had been replaced by something far heavier. Every mile brought him closer to an answer he could no longer postpone. As he pulled into the driveway, he saw Malik laughing on the front porch while helping Angela arrange boxes for a neighborhood donation drive. They looked like the family he had always dreamed of having. And for one brief moment Darius wished he could remain in that driveway forever, suspended between hope and truth, because once the sun rose the next morning, one of them would disappear forever. The next morning arrived with a kind of silence Darius had never experienced before. He woke before dawn, long before Angela's alarm clock began to buzz, and sat at the edge of the bed staring into the darkness. Every instinct told him to cancel the appointment, to throw away every question that had invaded his life over the past week, and return to the comfort of believing everything was exactly as it had always seemed. But another part of him knew that ignorance was no longer possible. Even if he never opened the report, the questions would remain. He showered, dressed, and quietly left the house without waking anyone. During the drive across town, he passed the park where he had taught Malik how to ride a bicycle, the church where they had celebrated Easter every spring, and the small diner where the two of them stopped for pancakes after basketball practice every Saturday morning. Those memories flooded his mind one after another, making him wonder whether truth had the power to erase love or whether love could somehow survive the truth. He wasn't sure which answer frightened him more. The laboratory occupied the 3rd floor of an ordinary office building, a place so unremarkable that Darius wondered how something capable of changing so many lives could exist behind such ordinary walls. The receptionist greeted him politely, verified his identification, and handed him a sealed envelope. She wished him a good day with a warm smile, completely unaware that the thin packet in his hands felt heavier than anything he had ever carried. He returned to his truck, locked the doors, and stared at the envelope for several minutes. His fingers trembled as he finally broke the seal. His eyes moved slowly across the page until they reached the conclusion. The words were brief, clinical, and completely without emotion. They didn't explain the years that had passed or the sacrifices he had made. They simply stated that Darius Coleman could not be identified as Malik's biological father. He read the sentence once, then again, then a third time, hoping the words might somehow rearrange themselves into something different. They never did. The report slipped from his hands onto the passenger seat as he leaned forward, resting his forehead against the steering wheel. For the first time since he was a young boy, Darius cried without trying to hide it. There were no witnesses, no comforting words, and no anger yet. There was only grief for a life he suddenly realized had never existed in the way he believed. When the tears finally stopped, Darius folded the report, placed it back inside the envelope, and drove aimlessly through the city. He wasn't ready to return home. He wasn't ready to confront Angela. Most of all, he wasn't ready to look into Malik's eyes while carrying a truth that neither of them had asked for. Every traffic light gave him another minute to think, and every minute produced another memory. He remembered staying awake all night when Malik was 5 years old because of a high fever. He remembered working double shifts to pay for summer basketball camps. He remembered the pride he felt the day Malik called him his hero during a Father's Day event at school. Those moments were real. They had happened exactly as he remembered them. No laboratory report could rewrite them. Yet another realization slowly settled over him. If the report was true, then someone had made a choice 18 years earlier to let him build his entire life around a lie. That choice hadn't lasted for a week or a month. It had continued every single day for nearly 2 decades. That evening, Darius returned home just before sunset. Angela was preparing dinner while Malik sat at the kitchen table filling out scholarship applications. They both greeted him the same way they always did, smiling as though it were any other Tuesday. Darius answered with a smile of his own, though it felt unfamiliar on his face. He slipped the envelope into the drawer of his desk before joining them at the table. During dinner, Malik talked excitedly about a campus tour he hoped to take the following month. Angela asked Darius whether he could rearrange his work schedule so they could all travel together. Darius listened carefully, realizing that every word spoken around that table belonged to a family standing on the edge of a truth that only one person knew. Several times he nearly reached into his pocket, removed the report, and placed it in the center of the table. Each time he stopped himself. Malik deserved better than to learn something so life-changing in the middle of an ordinary dinner. Angela deserved the opportunity to explain herself face to face. And Darius deserved answers that could never fit inside a laboratory report. As the meal ended and the dishes were cleared away, he quietly made up his mind. Tomorrow, he would ask Angela a question that would determine the future of every person sitting in that house. Whether she answered with honesty or another lie would decide what happened next. The next morning, Darius watched Angela more closely than he ever had before. It wasn't because he wanted to catch her doing something wrong. That opportunity had already passed 18 years earlier. What he wanted now was to understand the woman he had shared nearly half his life with. How had she carried a secret this enormous without it changing the way she laughed, celebrated birthdays, planned vacations, or looked him in the eyes every single day? As she poured coffee into his favorite mug and reminded him not to skip lunch because he had a long day ahead, she looked exactly like the woman he had fallen in love with. Her kindness seemed genuine. Her concern sounded sincere. That was what confused him the most. The person standing in front of him didn't resemble the image of someone capable of maintaining such an enormous deception for nearly 2 decades. Yet the DNA report resting inside his desk drawer didn't leave room for misunderstanding. One of those realities had to give way, and Darius knew the conversation he had been avoiding could no longer wait. Before leaving for work, he quietly asked Angela if they could have dinner alone that evening after Malik went to a friend's house. She smiled without hesitation and agreed, unaware that those few words marked the beginning of the most difficult conversation of their marriage. Throughout the day, Darius found himself thinking less about the affair and more about the people surrounding it. Affairs happen every day, painful as they are. What haunted him was the possibility that so many people had chosen silence together. He remembered Angela's parents insisting they host every Thanksgiving at their house. He remembered family vacations where conversations seemed to pause whenever he unexpectedly walked into a room. He remembered church gatherings where older members of the congregation would smile warmly at him, then exchange glances he never understood. At the time, he assumed he was imagining things or simply interrupting private conversations. Now those memories returned with a different meaning. He began asking himself how many opportunities people had been given to tell him the truth. Did someone ever try and lose the courage? Did another convince themselves the lie had gone on too long to expose? Or had everyone quietly agreed that preserving the appearance of a happy family mattered more than the man whose life had been built on that appearance? Those questions hurt almost as much as the DNA report itself because they suggested that betrayal had become a shared responsibility rather than the decision of one person. That evening, the house grew unusually quiet after Malik left to spend time with friends. Darius and Angela sat across from one another in the living room, the same room where they had celebrated anniversaries, wrapped Christmas presents, and planned for the future they believed they would grow old enjoying together. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Darius reached into the drawer beside his chair, removed the sealed laboratory envelope, and placed it gently on the coffee table between them. Angela looked at the envelope, then back at Darius. The color slowly drained from her face. Before he said a single word, she seemed to understand exactly what he was holding. Her hands began to tremble. Tears gathered in her eyes almost instantly, but Darius noticed something that stayed with him for years afterward. She did not ask what the report said. She did not question where it came from. She did not suggest there had been some mistake. Instead, she lowered her head, covered her face with both hands, and whispered so softly that Darius almost didn't hear her. "I prayed this day would never come. Those 7 words answered more questions than any explanation she could have offered. In that moment, Darius realized he wasn't about to discover whether there had been a lie. He was about to learn how long the lie had truly been living inside his own home. For nearly a minute, neither of them moved. The silence between them felt heavier than any argument they could have had. Finally, Darius spoke in a calm voice that surprised even him. He asked only one question. "Is Malik my son?" Angela closed her eyes, tears running down her cheeks as she struggled to steady her breathing. When she finally looked up, she didn't search for excuses or attempt to soften the truth. She simply shook her head. Darius felt the room grow impossibly still. The answer he had feared was now undeniable. Yet another question immediately followed, one that had become even more important than the first. Looking directly into Angela's eyes, Darius asked quietly, "Tell me the truth about everything. And before you say another word, answer this. How many people already knew?" Angela lowered her head and pressed both hands together so tightly that her knuckles turned pale. For several long moments, she couldn't bring herself to answer. Darius remained perfectly still, refusing to interrupt the silence. After 18 years of believing he understood every chapter of his marriage, he had learned that silence often revealed more than words ever could. Finally, Angela took a slow breath and looked toward the family photographs covering the wall across from them. There were pictures from birthdays, vacations, church events, graduations, and anniversaries. Every frame represented a memory they had built together, yet she could barely look at them. "I never wanted this conversation to happen," she whispered, her voice breaking under the weight of emotions she had buried for years. "I told myself that if I loved you enough, if I became the wife you deserved, if we gave Malik a good life, eventually the past would stop following us. I convinced myself that every year we stayed together made it easier to keep going. Then 1 year became 5. 5 became 10. Before I realized it, 18 years had passed, and I was more afraid of losing you than I was of telling you the truth." Darius listened without saying a word. Her confession explained why she had remained silent, but it did nothing to answer the question that continued to echo through his mind. He wasn't searching for reasons anymore. He was searching for names. Angela wiped her eyes before speaking again. "It happened before we had been married a full year," she said quietly. "You were working almost every day trying to keep your business alive. We hardly saw each other for weeks at a time. I felt lonely, and I made the worst decision of my life. There was no excuse for it then, and there isn't one now." She paused, fighting back another wave of tears. "A few weeks later, I found out I was pregnant. The dates were too close together, and I couldn't honestly say who Malik's biological father was. I was terrified. I kept telling myself I would tell you the next day, then the next week, then after the baby was born. Every time I tried, I imagined watching you walk out the front door forever, and I couldn't bring myself to do it. When Malik was born, you held him before I did. I saw the way you looked at him, and I made a decision that has haunted me every day since. I chose the lie because I was afraid of losing the life we had just begun." Darius closed his eyes for a moment, allowing her words to settle. He wasn't trying to imagine the affair anymore. He was trying to imagine 18 years of waking up beside someone who carried that secret every single day without ever letting him see it. The room grew quiet again until Darius finally asked the question he had been holding on to since the hospital. Who was his biological father? Angela's shoulders slumped as though the question itself had exhausted her. "His name is Andre Brooks," she answered softly. Darius didn't react immediately. The name felt familiar because it belonged to someone who had stood beside him through some of the most important moments of his life. Andre had attended backyard cookouts, family reunions, and church picnics. He had congratulated Darius on promotions, celebrated Malik's birthdays, and even stood beside him during difficult seasons when business was struggling. Darius remembered trusting Andre enough to leave him alone in the house while running errands. He remembered thanking him for always being a dependable friend. The memories came flooding back with painful clarity, each one carrying a meaning Darius had never considered until now. He wasn't simply mourning the loss of trust in his marriage. He was beginning to understand that another relationship, one he had considered unbreakable, had also been built on deception. After another long silence, Darius asked the question he had dreaded from the very beginning. How many people knew? Angela's eyes filled with tears once more. My parents knew after Malik was born because I couldn't carry the secret alone, she admitted. A few months later, I told my sister. Andre knew from the beginning because I told him there was a chance Malik could be his son. Years later, after the resemblance became harder to ignore, I believe a few relatives began to suspect, but I never confirmed anything. My parents begged me to tell you several times, especially when Malik was little. I kept saying I would. Every year that passed made it harder. Eventually, everyone stopped asking because they believed telling you would destroy our family. Darius looked around the living room once more, his eyes resting on the smiling faces captured in the photographs lining the walls. For the first time, he realized those pictures had recorded two entirely different histories. One was the life he believed he was living. The other was the life everyone else had quietly protected from him. The realization settled over him with heartbreaking clarity. The greatest wound was no longer the affair itself. It was the knowledge that so many people had watched him devote his heart, his time, and his future to a family built on a secret, and not one of them had found the courage to tell him the truth before it was too late. Darius didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam the coffee table or throw the framed photographs against the wall. The anger he expected to feel never arrived in the way he had imagined. Instead, there was a quiet emptiness that settled over him, the kind that leaves a person staring at familiar surroundings while feeling like they've somehow wandered into a stranger's home. He slowly stood, walked toward the hallway, and stopped in front of a photograph taken on Malik's 10th birthday. In the picture, Malik had one arm wrapped around Darius while proudly holding a basketball trophy in the other. Angela stood beside them smiling, and Andre was just a few feet away in the background, laughing with other family friends. Darius stared at that photograph for so long that the room became completely silent. Was he looking at me that day knowing the truth? He finally asked without turning around. Angela lowered her eyes. She couldn't answer immediately because she already knew the answer would hurt. Yes, she whispered. He knew. Darius nodded slowly. So every birthday, every barbecue, every graduation, every Father's Day, he shook my hand, smiled in my face, and never once thought I deserved to know? Angela quietly replied. I believe he convinced himself he was protecting Malik. Darius let out a faint laugh, but there was no amusement in it. People always say they were protecting someone. Funny how the person they're protecting is almost never the one living the lie. He walked toward the front window and looked out at the neighborhood where he had spent nearly 20 years building what he believed was a happy life. Children were riding bicycles down the street, while neighbors waved at one another as if nothing in the world had changed. Darius wondered how many of those familiar faces had looked at him over the years carrying knowledge he didn't have. He remembered conversations that suddenly ended when he approached. He remembered catching people exchanging quick glances whenever someone joked that Malik looked more like Andre than anyone else. At the time, he dismissed those moments as harmless observations. Now every one of them returned with a different meaning. Did people in this neighborhood know? He asked quietly. Angela hesitated before answering. Some suspected. I don't know who knew for certain. Darius closed his eyes. That's enough, he said. Whether they knew or guessed doesn't matter anymore. The point is I was the last person to learn the truth about my own family. He wasn't speaking out of bitterness anymore. He was stating a fact, one that hurt more deeply the longer he allowed himself to think about it. The hardest thought of all wasn't about Angela or Andre. It was about Malik. Darius knew that within a matter of hours, he would have to decide whether to tell the young man he had raised from infancy that his life was also built on a secret. Malik hadn't asked for any of this. He hadn't chosen the circumstances of his birth, and he certainly hadn't chosen to spend 18 years believing Darius was his biological father. Every memory Darius treasured belonged to Malik as well. Their fishing trips, late-night talks before basketball tournaments, father and son road trips, teaching him how to shave, celebrating his first job, comforting him after his first heartbreak. None of those moments had been fake. They had simply been built on incomplete truth. Darius realized that if he allowed his anger toward Angela and Andre to shape the way he treated Malik, another innocent life would be damaged by a decision made long before Malik was old enough to understand it. That realization became the first clear thought he'd had since opening the DNA report. Whatever happened next, Malik would never have to wonder whether Darius loved him. Love had never been measured by biology, and Darius refused to let someone else's deception redefine 18 years of fatherhood. Angela finally broke the silence again. He's going to ask why everything feels different, she said softly. He notices things. He always has. Darius nodded. Then he deserves honesty. Maybe for the first time in this house, he deserves to hear the complete truth. Angela began to cry again, knowing there was no longer any way to delay the conversation she had feared for nearly 2 decades. Darius reached for his car keys and slipped them into his pocket. I'm not ready to tell him tonight, he said calmly. If we do this, we do it together. No more lies. No more half-truths. No more stories designed to protect adults while leaving everyone else to live with the consequences. He paused at the front door before looking back at Angela one last time. Tomorrow morning, we're going to sit down with Malik, and for the first time in 18 years, everyone in this family is going to be living with the same truth. What happens after that? None of us can predict. Darius barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, another memory surfaced. He remembered the first time Malik called him Dad. He remembered helping him build a model airplane for a fifth-grade science project after spending 3 frustrating evenings trying to figure out the instructions together. He remembered sitting in the bleachers during countless basketball games, cheering louder than anyone else in the gym. Those moments weren't connected to biology. They were connected to time, sacrifice, patience, and love. Yet as comforting as those memories were, they couldn't erase the questions that still lingered. Darius found himself wondering what Malik's future might look like once the truth came out. Would he feel betrayed by Angela? Would he feel obligated to find Andre? Would he begin questioning every memory they had shared together? Those thoughts weighed heavily on Darius because he understood something that nobody else seemed to appreciate. The truth wasn't about to destroy one life. It was about to reshape 3 lives at the same time. As the first light of morning crept through the curtains, he made himself a promise. Whatever happened after today, Malik would never have to face it alone. At exactly 9 o'clock, Malik walked through the front door, carrying a bag of breakfast sandwiches and coffee. He smiled as he stepped into the kitchen. "I figured we'd all eat together before I head to Coach Williams' place," he said, setting the food on the counter. Neither Darius nor Angela returned his smile. Malik immediately sensed something was wrong. He looked from one parent to the other, his expression changing from cheerful curiosity to concern. "What's going on?" he asked. "Did something happen?" Darius took a slow breath and motioned for him to sit down. The room fell completely silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Malik looked at his parents again, his confidence beginning to disappear. "You're starting to scare me," he admitted. Darius reached across the table and gently placed his hand over Malik's. "Son," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion pressing against every word. "What we're about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear. Before we say anything else, I need you to know one thing. Nothing you hear today will ever change how much I love you. Nothing." Malik's eyes immediately filled with confusion. He looked toward Angela, hoping she would explain what was happening, but she couldn't bring herself to speak. Tears rolled down her face before she uttered a single word. "Finally," she whispered, "I've kept something from both of you for a very long time." Malik frowned, trying to understand. "Mom, what are you talking about?" She struggled to steady her breathing before continuing. "The man who raised you, the man who has loved you every day of your life, is your father in every way that matters. But biologically," her voice broke. She covered her mouth, unable to continue. Darius gently finished the sentence for her. "I'm not your biological father." The words seemed to hang in the air long after they were spoken. Malik stared at Darius without blinking. Then he looked at Angela, then back at Darius again. For several moments, he didn't speak at all. It was as though his mind had heard the words but refused to accept them. Finally, almost in a whisper, he asked, "Is this some kind of joke?" Neither of them answered. Their silence became the answer. Malik pushed his chair back so suddenly that it scraped loudly across the hardwood floor. "No," he said, shaking his head repeatedly. "No, that's impossible." He looked directly at Darius. "You're my dad. You've always been my dad." Darius stood slowly and took a cautious step forward. "I always will be if you'll let me," he said softly. Malik's breathing became uneven as he turned toward Angela. "How long have you known?" She couldn't hide from the question anymore. "Since before you were born," she answered through tears. Malik's face changed instantly. The confusion disappeared, replaced by disbelief and heartbreak. "You mean, you've known my whole life?" Angela nodded. "Yes." Malik took several steps backward until he reached the living room wall. He pressed both hands against his head as if trying to stop the thoughts racing through his mind. "Who is he?" he asked after a long silence. "Who is my biological father?" Angela lowered her eyes once again. Saying the name aloud felt like reopening a wound that had barely begun to heal. "Andre Brooks," she whispered. Malik froze. His expression suggested he recognized the name immediately. He wasn't thinking about a stranger. He was thinking about the man who had attended birthdays, family cookouts, graduation parties, and holiday dinners for nearly 18 years. The man he had always called Uncle Andre. For several long seconds, Malik didn't say a single word. His eyes remained fixed on the floor as though he were trying to remember every conversation, every handshake, and every laugh he had ever shared with Andre. Then he slowly looked up at his mother. "Uncle Andre?" he asked, almost as if saying the name out loud might somehow change the answer. Angela could only nod. The pain on Malik's face was immediate. "He knew?" he asked. Angela nodded again, unable to meet his eyes. "Yes." Malik turned toward Darius. "You mean he stood next to you all these years, looked you in the face, came to our house, and never told you?" Darius answered honestly. "That's what I've been told." Malik took a slow breath, but it wasn't enough to calm the storm building inside him. "And Grandma knew? Grandpa knew? Aunt Rochelle knew?" Angela quietly whispered, "Yes." Malik let out a short, disbelieving laugh before shaking his head. So everybody was protecting the secret except the one person who deserved to know it. No one corrected him because no one could. Malik walked into the hallway, stopping in front of the wall covered with family photographs. He began pulling frames from the wall one by one, not throwing them, not breaking them, simply holding them in his hands as though seeing them for the first time. There was a picture of Darius teaching him how to fish when he was 7. Another showed the two of them standing together after Malik's middle school championship game, both covered in sweat and smiling from ear to ear. There was one from his high school graduation ceremony where Darius had his arm wrapped proudly around his shoulders. Malik stared at each photograph before placing it gently on the dining table. "These weren't fake," he finally said, his voice trembling. "Every time I called you Dad, I meant it. Every birthday card I made in elementary school, every Father's Day gift, every time somebody asked who my hero was." He stopped speaking because emotion had caught in his throat. Darius crossed the room and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Those memories belong to us," he said quietly. "Nobody can take them away. A laboratory report doesn't erase 18 years of being your father." Malik nodded slowly, tears filling his eyes. "I know," he whispered. "You're still my dad. That part isn't changing." Angela watched the exchange between them, and the weight of what she had done seemed heavier than ever before. For years, she had convinced herself that keeping the secret protected her son from pain. Standing in that room, she realized the opposite had happened. By delaying the truth, she had multiplied the heartbreak for everyone she loved. She tried to speak several times before finally finding the courage. "Malik, I never wanted you to carry this burden." Malik looked at her with tears streaming down his face. "But I am carrying it," he replied. "I'm carrying 18 years of questions that should have never existed. I don't even know who I am anymore. Every time I saw Uncle Andre, was he looking at me as his son? Did he ever want to tell me? Did he ever think about what this would do to me if I found out?" Angela had no answers. She could only admit that fear had controlled her decisions for nearly 2 decades. "I kept believing there would be a better time," she said softly. Malik shook his head. "There wasn't a better time. There was only the right time. And that was 18 years ago." The room fell silent again until Darius quietly asked one final question. "Does Andre know we're aware of the truth?" Angela hesitated before answering. "No, I haven't spoken to him about any of this in years." Darius nodded thoughtfully. His expression remained calm, but his eyes revealed a determination Angela had never seen before. "Then that changes today," he said. "I'm not looking for a fight, and I'm not interested in revenge. But after 18 years of silence, there are questions that only one person can answer. I spent nearly half my life believing he was one of my closest friends. If he chose to live with this secret all these years, then he owes both of us the truth face to face." Malik looked at Darius, then at his mother. His emotions were still raw, but one thing had become clear. This story wasn't over. The DNA report had answered one question, but the man everyone had called Uncle Andre was about to answer the rest. Darius didn't call Andre that afternoon. He wanted time to think before hearing another explanation that might only deepen the hurt already sitting on his shoulders. Instead, he drove alone through the neighborhoods where so many memories had been made. Every familiar street reminded him of another chapter of the life he believed he understood. He passed the community center where Malik had played his first basketball game, the church where he and Angela had renewed their wedding vows on their 10th anniversary, and the small restaurant where Andre had once raised a glass and toasted to family. That memory lingered longer than the others. Darius remembered everyone clapping while Andre smiled directly at him. At the time, it felt like the words came from genuine friendship. Now they echoed differently. He wasn't trying to convince himself that every smile had been fake. He simply wanted to know how someone could celebrate another man's family while carrying a truth that belonged to them both. By the time he returned home, he had made up his mind. The conversation with Andre wouldn't happen over the phone. Some questions deserved to be asked face to face, where silence, hesitation, and expression could reveal as much as the answers themselves. Meanwhile, Malik remained in his bedroom for most of the afternoon. He ignored calls from friends, left text messages unanswered, and sat on the edge of his bed surrounded by memories that suddenly felt unfamiliar. On the shelf across from him were trophies Darius had proudly displayed after every season. Hanging beside them was a framed Father's Day card he had made in 3rd grade with the words, "My dad is my hero." He picked it up and stared at the uneven handwriting of his younger self before quietly smiling through tears. That little boy hadn't been pretending. Every word had been sincere. Darius had shown up for every game, every school meeting, every difficult conversation, and every celebration. The truth about biology didn't erase those years. Yet another question had begun taking shape in Malik's mind. If Andre had known all along, why had he remained only Uncle Andre? Did he ever feel guilty? Did he ever regret staying silent? Or had he simply accepted that someone else was living the life he could have claimed? The uncertainty was exhausting, and Malik realized that he needed answers just as much as Darius did. Late that evening, there was a knock at the front door. Angela looked through the window and immediately froze. Standing on the porch were her parents. They had spoken briefly on the phone earlier, and after hearing the emotion in Angela's voice, they decided to come over. Darius opened the door without saying a word and stepped aside to let them in. The atmosphere inside the house was unlike anything they had experienced before. Angela's father, Harold, looked older than Darius remembered, his shoulders weighed down by a burden he had carried for years. He slowly removed his hat and looked directly at Darius. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," he began quietly, "but I owe you an apology." Darius didn't interrupt. Harold continued. "The day Angela told us she was pregnant, your mother-in-law and I begged her to tell you everything before the wedding anniversary came around. We believed honesty was the only chance your marriage had. She kept saying she would. Then Malik was born, and we watched the way you loved that little boy. Every month that passed made the truth harder to speak. We convinced ourselves that staying silent was protecting him. Looking back now, I realize we weren't protecting Malik. We were protecting ourselves from the consequences of telling you." His voice cracked before he finished the sentence, and for the first time since walking through the front door, he looked completely defeated. Darius listened carefully before asking the question that had been troubling him from the beginning. "Did you ever once think about sitting me down and telling me anyway?" Harold closed his eyes for a moment before answering. "More times than I can count. I even drove to your job once, determined to tell you. I sat in my truck for nearly an hour. Then I pictured Malik growing up without the only father he had ever known, and I lost my courage." Darius nodded slowly. "You weren't protecting Malik," he replied calmly. "You were making a decision for me. You decided I didn't deserve the chance to choose my own future." Harold lowered his head because he knew there was nothing he could say to change that. The room remained silent until Darius finally spoke again. "Tomorrow morning, I'm meeting Andre. He deserves the opportunity to tell his side of the story. After 18 years of silence, I want to hear every word from the man who looked me in the eye, shook my hand, and called me his brother while knowing a truth that should have come from him long ago." As those words settled over the room, everyone understood that the next conversation would determine whether any part of this fractured family could ever begin to heal. The following morning arrived with an uneasy calm. Darius left the house before sunrise, carrying nothing but his keys, his wallet, and 18 years of unanswered questions. He had called Andre the night before with only one sentence: "We need to talk." There had been a long pause before Andre quietly agreed to meet at a small park on the edge of town where the two of them had often taken Malik fishing when he was a child. Neither man suggested another location. Perhaps they both understood that if the truth had begun with memories, it would end where so many of those memories had been made. As Darius pulled into the nearly empty parking lot, he saw Andre already sitting on a weathered wooden bench facing the lake. His shoulders were slumped, and his eyes remained fixed on the still water in front of him. For a brief moment, Darius remembered the countless mornings they had stood side by side in that very spot, laughing while Malik proudly held up another small catch. Those memories had once represented friendship. Now they felt like evidence from a life neither of them could fully explain. Andre stood as Darius approached, but neither man reached out for a handshake. There were no greetings, no attempt at small talk, and no effort to pretend this was an ordinary conversation. Darius remained standing for a moment before finally taking a seat on the opposite end of the bench. The silence between them stretched so long that it almost became uncomfortable. Finally, Andre spoke first. "Angela called me yesterday," he said quietly. "She told me everything." Darius nodded once. "Then you already know why I'm here." Andre lowered his head. "I do." Darius looked out across the lake before asking the question that had haunted him for days. "When did you know Malik was your biological son?" Andre answered without hesitation. "I never knew for certain. Angela told me there was a possibility before he was born. A few months later, when I saw him for the first time, I started believing it was true. As he got older, it became harder to ignore the resemblance." Darius turned toward him. "Yet you never asked for a DNA test." Andre shook his head. "No. You never tried to be his father." "No. You never told me." Andre closed his eyes. "No." For the first time since arriving, emotion began to show on Andre's face. "I know what you're thinking," he said softly. "You're wondering how I could watch you raise him while staying silent. I've asked myself that same question thousands of times." He paused before continuing. "The truth is, the first time I saw you holding Malik in the hospital, I knew I'd already lost the right to make decisions about his life. You loved him before he could even open his eyes. I watched you become the father every child deserves, and I convinced myself that stepping forward would only destroy 3 lives instead of 1. Darius listened carefully before replying. That wasn't your decision to make. Andre nodded immediately. You're right. It wasn't. Another silence settled between them. Finally, Andre looked directly at Darius. Every birthday party, every graduation, every Christmas. I hated myself for being there. I considered telling you more times than I can remember. I even wrote you a letter once. I kept it in my desk for almost a year. Then I burned it because I couldn't find the courage to send it. Darius studied his face, searching for signs that the confession was simply another attempt to ease his own guilt. Instead, he saw a man who looked exhausted by years of carrying something he should never have carried alone. Darius reached into his jacket pocket and removed a folded photograph. It showed the 3 of them standing together after one of Malik's youth basketball championships. Andre was smiling with one arm around Darius, while Malik stood proudly in front, holding a trophy almost as tall as he was. Darius handed the photograph to Andre. Do you remember this day? Andre nodded slowly. Of course I do. Darius pointed to Malik's smiling face. He thought he had 2 men who cared about him standing beside each other. One was his father. The other was his uncle. He never imagined that both of those things were true in different ways. Andre stared at the photograph for a long time before quietly wiping away a tear. I've missed birthdays in my own family, he admitted. I've lost jobs. I've been through a divorce. None of those things stayed with me the way this secret did. Every time Malik called me Uncle Andre, I knew I had accepted a role that wasn't honest. But every time he called you Dad, I also knew he was exactly where he belonged. Darius took a deep breath before asking the question he had saved for last. If you could go back to the day Angela told you she was pregnant, what would you do differently? Andre didn't hesitate. I'd tell you the truth before Malik was born. Then whatever happened after that would have been your choice, not mine. Those words lingered between them as the morning sun reflected across the lake. For the first time since the DNA results arrived, Darius realized that every adult involved had spent 18 years trying to outrun a single decision. None of them had succeeded. The truth had simply waited until everyone had something far greater to lose. Darius remained seated on the bench long after Andre stopped speaking. He wasn't searching for another confession or hoping to uncover one final secret. The answers he had spent days chasing were finally in front of him, and somehow they brought less relief than he expected. The silence between the 2 men was no longer filled with suspicion. It was filled with regret. Darius looked out across the lake, remembering a warm Saturday morning nearly 10 years earlier when Malik had proudly reeled in the biggest fish of the day. He remembered laughing as Andre pretended to be jealous while Malik ran back and forth across the dock celebrating his victory. At the time, it had seemed like nothing more than 2 close friends sharing a memory with a child they both cared about. Now that same memory carried a completely different meaning. Yet despite everything he had learned, one truth refused to change. On that day, it had been Darius who untangled Malik's fishing line, cleaned the mud from his sneakers, and listened to him talk all the way home about becoming a professional fisherman. Those moments had belonged to Darius. They always would. Finally, Darius stood and looked directly at Andre. I'm not here to decide what role you should have in Malik's life, he said calmly. That's no longer my decision, and it certainly isn't yours. He's 18 years old. He's old enough to choose for himself. Andre nodded, understanding the weight of those words. If he never wants to see me again, he replied quietly, I'll accept that. I don't have the right to demand anything from him. Darius studied him for a moment before asking one final question. Did you ever love him? Andre's eyes immediately filled with tears. Every single day, he answered. But loving someone from a distance doesn't make you their father. It just reminds you of every moment you gave away. Darius could hear the sincerity in his voice. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't asking to be welcomed into Malik's life. He was simply acknowledging a loss that had begun 18 years earlier with a decision he could never undo. When Darius returned home, he found Malik sitting alone on the back porch. The young man looked exhausted, as though he had aged several years overnight. Without saying a word, Darius walked over and sat beside him. For several minutes, they watched the afternoon breeze move through the trees in complete silence. Finally, Malik spoke. Did you meet with him? Darius nodded. I did. Malik looked straight ahead. What was he like? Darius thought carefully before answering. Broken, he said. Not because he was caught. Because he realized he can't get those 18 years back. Malik absorbed the words quietly before asking another question. Does he want to be part of my life now? Darius answered honestly. He said the choice belongs to you. He isn't expecting anything. Malik leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I don't even know what I feel, he admitted. Part of me is angry. Part of me is curious. But every time I think about the word dad, I don't picture him. I picture you teaching me how to ride my bike. I picture you helping me with algebra when neither of us understood the homework. I picture you sitting in the emergency room when I broke my wrist in 8th grade. Those are the memories that come to mind. Darius smiled sadly. Then hold on to those memories, he replied. No one can rewrite them. Several days passed before Malik made another difficult decision. He asked Darius if he would accompany him to meet Andre one time, not to begin a new relationship, but to hear directly from the man whose absence had shaped his entire life without him realizing it. Darius agreed immediately. He understood that some questions couldn't be answered by anyone else. When the day finally arrived, the meeting was quiet, respectful, and filled with long pauses. Andre apologized without asking for sympathy. He accepted responsibility without blaming Angela or anyone else. Malik listened carefully before asking only one question that caught everyone by surprise. If Mom had told the truth before I was born, would you have fought to raise me? Andre lowered his eyes for several moments before answering. I honestly don't know, he admitted. I was young, immature, and afraid. I'd like to believe I would have stepped up, but the truth is I can't promise what I would have done back then. That's one of the hardest things I've had to accept. Malik appreciated the honesty. For the first time since the secret came to light, someone had admitted uncertainty instead of pretending to have perfect answers. As the conversation ended, Malik shook Andre's hand. It wasn't an act of forgiveness, nor was it a rejection. It was simply an acknowledgement that the truth had finally been spoken. Whatever relationship might exist in the future would have to grow from honesty rather than silence. And for the first time in 18 years, everyone involved was beginning to understand the difference. The weeks that followed were unlike anything the Coleman family had ever experienced. There were no dramatic arguments echoing through the house, and no desperate attempts to pretend life had returned to normal. Instead, there was an unfamiliar honesty that made even ordinary conversations feel different. Darius and Malik continued their Saturday breakfasts at the same neighborhood diner they had visited for years. The waitress greeted them the way she always had, calling Darius Dad, with a smile as she poured their coffee and orange juice. Neither of them corrected her. As they sat together in the familiar booth, Malik looked across the table and quietly said, You know, I used to think being a father was something that happened because of biology. Now I think it's something you earn every single day. Darius smiled for the first time in what felt like weeks. Your grandfather used to tell me something similar, he replied. He'd say that any man can help bring a child into the world, but it takes a different kind of man to stay when life gets difficult. Malik nodded. Then you've been my father every single day of my life. Those words meant more to Darius than any DNA report ever could. They didn't erase the pain, but they reminded him that love had survived where deception had failed. Angela, however, found herself facing consequences that could no longer be avoided. The trust she had relied on for nearly 2 decades had disappeared almost overnight. Every conversation with Darius was respectful, but the effortless closeness they once shared was gone. They attended counseling together, hoping to understand whether a marriage could survive such an enormous betrayal. Session after session, Angela accepted responsibility for the decisions she had made. She never blamed loneliness, fear, or immaturity again. Instead, she acknowledged that every day she remained silent had been another decision to continue the deception. One evening after returning from counseling, she looked at Darius and quietly asked, Do you think you'll ever forgive me? Darius took a long time before answering. Forgiveness and trust aren't the same thing, he said gently. I can choose to let go of my anger because I don't want to carry it for the rest of my life. But trust is something that was built over 18 years and lost in a single conversation. I honestly don't know if it can ever be rebuilt. Angela lowered her head, understanding that some wounds don't disappear simply because an apology is sincere. Several months later, Darius made one final decision that surprised everyone around him. He invited both families to gather at the community park where Malik had celebrated countless birthdays as a child. Angela's parents came. Andre arrived quietly, keeping his distance unless Malik approached him first. Friends from church and a handful of close relatives also attended, though the atmosphere remained understandably cautious. As everyone settled into their seats, Darius stood beside the picnic tables and looked around at the people who had shaped the last 18 years of his life. I'm not here because everything has been fixed, he began calmly. Some things will probably never be the same again, but I refuse to let one lie define every good memory we've shared. He paused before continuing. I lost trust in people I loved. That's true, but I also gained something I didn't have before. The truth. And while the truth arrived painfully late, it's still better than spending another 18 years living inside a story that wasn't real. The gathering remained quiet, as everyone absorbed his words. Some people wiped away tears. Others simply looked down, carrying their own regrets. As the afternoon came to an end, Malik walked over to Darius, holding an old photograph he had found while cleaning his room. It was faded around the edges and showed a much younger Darius kneeling beside a 6-year-old Malik after building a homemade treehouse together. Both of them were covered in sawdust, smiling proudly at a project that leaned slightly to one side, but had become their favorite place to spend summer afternoons. Malik handed the photograph to Darius and laughed softly. "Remember when Mom said that treehouse would never survive a storm?" Darius smiled. She was right. It barely survived the summer. They both laughed, the first genuine laughter either of them had shared since the truth came out. Malik looked at the picture once more before slipping it back into his pocket. "Funny thing is," he said quietly, "the treehouse eventually fell apart because it wasn't built on the strongest foundation. But the memories we made inside it are still standing." Darius looked at his son with quiet pride, realizing how much wisdom could emerge from heartbreak. Sometimes families aren't defined by the way they begin. They're defined by the choices people make after everything falls apart. And as the sun slowly disappeared beyond the trees, Darius understood that while he could never reclaim the 18 years that had been shaped by a painful secret, he still had the years ahead. And this time, they would be built on the one thing that had been missing from the beginning: the truth. Nearly a year passed before Darius truly understood how deeply the truth had changed him. The pain no longer greeted him every morning, but it still appeared without warning. Sometimes it happened while driving past the church where he and Angela had exchanged vows. Other times it arrived while cleaning the garage and discovering an old baseball glove he had bought for Malik when he was 12. Healing, he learned, wasn't a straight path. Some days felt almost normal, while others carried the same weight as the morning he opened the DNA report. The difference was that he no longer allowed those moments to define him. Instead of asking himself why the deception had happened, he began asking a different question. What kind of man did he want to become after surviving it? That question slowly became more important than every answer he had spent months searching for. Malik had also changed in ways that surprised everyone around him. College introduced him to people who knew nothing about his family's history. To his classmates, he was simply another freshman trying to balance classes, work, and friendships. For the first time since learning the truth, he experienced moments when he wasn't thinking about DNA tests, hidden secrets, or painful conversations. Yet every Sunday evening, without fail, he called Darius. Sometimes they talked about football scores, sometimes about classes, and sometimes about nothing important at all. Those conversations reminded them both that the strongest relationships are often built through ordinary moments rather than dramatic ones. One weekend, while helping Darius repair the fence around the backyard, Malik suddenly looked up and smiled. "You know," he said, "I used to think our story was about finding out who my biological father was. Now I think it was really about discovering who never stopped being my father." Darius didn't answer immediately. He simply reached over, patted Malik on the shoulder, and handed him another piece of lumber. Some moments didn't require words. Angela continued rebuilding her life one honest day at a time. She understood that forgiveness could never be demanded and that trust would return only if others freely chose to offer it again. She remained close to Malik, though their relationship carried difficult conversations that should have happened years earlier. She also made peace with the fact that Darius had decided to move forward separately. Their divorce was finalized respectfully, without courtroom arguments or public accusations. Friends who learned the truth often asked Darius whether he regretted the years he had spent raising Malik. Every single time, his answer was exactly the same. "Never. I regret the lie. I don't regret loving my son." That answer gradually spread through their community, and many people who had quietly watched the family from a distance came to understand something they had overlooked. The greatest measure of fatherhood had never been found inside a laboratory report. It had been found in 18 years of showing up when it mattered most. One autumn afternoon, Darius received an unexpected letter in the mail. There was no return address, but he recognized the handwriting almost immediately. It was from Andre. Inside was a short note thanking him for giving Malik the kind of childhood every boy deserves. Andre wrote that he had decided to move to another state after accepting a new job, believing that distance would allow everyone the space they needed to continue healing. He ended the letter with one sentence that stayed with Darius long after he folded the paper and placed it back inside the envelope. "You became the father I should have had the courage to become." Darius read those words several times before placing the letter inside the same photo album where he had once searched desperately for signs that his life was built on a lie. This time, he wasn't looking for hidden clues. He was simply closing a chapter that had finally reached its end. As the comments began pouring in from people who had heard Darius's story, one message stood out from all the others. It wasn't from a close friend, a family member, or even someone who lived in the same state. It was from an older man who wrote only a few sentences. I lived almost the same story. I carried my anger for 30 years. Don't let bitterness become the rest of your life. Years later, when people asked Darius what the greatest lesson of his life had been, they were often surprised by his answer. He never spoke first about betrayal, broken trust, or the DNA results that changed everything. Instead, he said, "The truth eventually found its way into my life, and it hurt more than I ever imagined. But it also taught me something I'll never forget. Family isn't only about how a story begins. It's about who stays, who loves, who sacrifices, and who keeps showing up when life becomes difficult." He would often pause before adding one final thought. If you're carrying a secret that has the power to change someone else's life, don't convince yourself that time will make it easier. Time doesn't erase the truth. It only increases the cost of hiding it. Those words became the closing lesson of Darius's journey, a reminder that honesty may be painful in the moment, but silence has a way of collecting interest until the debt becomes almost impossible to repay. And perhaps that's the hardest lesson of all. The truth may arrive late, but it almost always arrives.